Well, like I was at work because I was working for it's now a defunct government agency, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. So working for the government, and actually that was a branch of the DoD. So we were like, I had been at work for like over an hour before the event started to unravel. And I worked at the National Museum of Health and Medicine. And so I was just in the collections area, which, there's no windows, there's no nothing, like you don't get radio reception or anything. And one of my coworkers, I was talking with another coworker, and one of them walked in. He said, "My wife just called me, and she said that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center." And we looked at him and we were like, "Wow, how odd." And I remember saying, "Well, it must have been a small plane, right?" And he was like, "There's no other information." And he walked off. And then, of course, shortly after that, everything started to happen in a really fast time. And I remember going into our archives, which was a different room in a different part of the building, and they could kind of get a radio reception. So, but we literally were standing holding each other's hands to make like a human antenna to get the radio reception better. And we were listening to Bob Edwards report it in real time. So we heard, the building collapsing through Bob Edwards. We heard, all the other things. There was the Pentagon's been hit, and then we were all told that to leave. Like the government shut down, and they said get out of DC. And so I think before I actually got out of the building, we knew that there had been a crash in Pennsylvania. But there were also rumors that there had been a crash at Camp David. I mean, there were a lot of rumors flying around and not really any good information. And then I drove home, which I lived 7 miles. And granted, it's Washington, D.C. area. So the 7 miles is not like 7 or 8 minutes like it would be around here, right? It normally would take like a half hour. It took me 3 hours to get home. 3 hours, because everybody was fleeing Washington, D.C. And then that night I got a call from my boss, who he was my boss at the museum, but he also was the what do I want to call it? The team commander for our disaster mortuary response team. And he was like, we had a warehouse facility that was in Maryland that the museum had for our kind of big oversized objects. And he basically said, meet me at the warehouse tomorrow morning. And we worked 12-hour days, or maybe probably 10-hour days for the next 2 days, trying to, there was an issue with getting permissions to get the DMORT team deployed, because it was not, we only had an agreement at that time. I don't know what the status is now, but at that time, to work transportation safety disaster. So under the auspices of the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. And but this was a terrorist event. So the lead government agency was not the NTSB, it was the FBI. There was no government mechanism to deploy us under the FBI. So if it had been FEMA or NTSB, we could have been there right away. So there was a slight delay. It took us more like 72 hours to get there. My boss, like I said, worked the phones, and I was there taking messages and running errands and stuff like that. And so we deployed finally. And I think it was the night of September 13th, we arrived. The whole team arrived from various places. And luckily, the way that DMORT is set up, it's regional, and it's by population. So our region was geographically very small, so everybody could drive, because there were no airplanes. I don't know if you're old enough to know that, but there were no flights. You could not get a flight. There were teams that were being deployed to New York that were flying on Army cargo planes, because that was the only thing. Only military aircraft was allowed in the air. But we all drove. We all got there. We got our hotel set up. And then we went to the site. And luckily, Pennsylvania has 2 volunteer statewide agencies that work disasters. And it's the Pennsylvania ID team, which is a group of volunteer dentists to help with dental IDs. And I think it was, I have to go back through my notes. I have it, but I think there's a Pennsylvania emergency response team as well. I don't remember how they're organized, but they were already on site, and they did a tremendous amount of groundwork for us because we were kind of behind. So like they had already figured out a suitable temporary morgue for us, which was the National Guard Armory in Shanksville, and they had worked out an agreement and had signed a contract for us to use it. They had been working with the Pennsylvania State Police, and so they had done a lot of coordination. The biggest problem we had when we hit the ground was we had our site, we had our hotel, they all helped with that, but we didn't have any equipment because DMORT does have temporary morgues that are mobile, and but they only had 2 at the time, and one was sent to the Pentagon and one was sent to New York. And so because it was only 44 dead in Pennsylvania, they said, figure it out. So luckily, again, we had a really good team commander, and he had some contacts with a private corporation that does disaster response, most of it overseas. And he was able to arrange a contract for their temporary morgue. So they basically supplied us. The problem is they had no anthropology equipment. And that's what I am, a forensic anthropology. So we called Penn State, who has a physical anthropologist, Dr. George Milner. And we said, George, please help us. And he was like, anything you need, I will give you from my lab. And so we had a car went out and picked up all of his lab equipment, and it came into our morgue, and we were good to go then. So there was a lot of people, helping out and coordinating. And we were there for, I believe it was 13 days on site until the FBI declared the site had been cleared of all human remains. And at that point, we were sent home. And at that, we left knowing that because we were doing DNA as we went along, it was prioritized, and we knew we had identified everybody. So we left the site knowing everybody had been positively identified, all families were going to get remains returned to them. Flight 93 became such an iconic flight with what the passengers did, and it was such a small number of individuals that basically, while I was there, we all didn't listen to as soon as the news, we would watch the news to hear about the Pentagon and to hear about, New York. But as soon as the news would switch to Pennsylvania, we would all turn off our TVs. Because we didn't want to know who the victims were. You needed to keep a certain amount of professional distance. But of course, over the years, I've been able to learn about them. And so, knowing who those people were. It was such a limited number of people too, that you're pretty sure you handled at least some part of everyone. So, it was, even though you wouldn't have known who they were at the time, but it's not like, there was thousands or even hundreds dead. So it was a much more, personal, I feel like we probably had a much more personal connection to the people that we identified than probably most of the other people that worked 9/11, because of just that it was a small accident in a huge, massive disaster. And they never told us the names at the time. They just said, we have 10 IDs now, we have 12 IDs, we're up to 20 IDs. We got it to, because there were 44, and even though there were 4 terrorists, they're just unique. We never identified them directly, like who was who, but there were 4 unique IDs or DNA profiles that didn't match any of the victims. So we got up to, so there were 40 victims, and we got to 39 of the victims, and we were sweating bullets, because it's like, we need, one person's out there, their family needs them to come home, we got to find them. And so when that news happened, that we got everybody, that was great. You work 12 hours a day, and you work 7 days a week until you were sent home. So it is pretty exhausting. And then we had, a half-hour commute each way. So we had pretty long days. So really all you had time to do was to you got up in the morning, you immediately went to the site, you got home at night, and you took a shower because you smell really bad after being in a morgue all day. and then you go out and you try and get to a restaurant before they stop serving food, because it's like 9 o'clock as you're trying to get fed. So yeah, it was, but we had a really good team. We had a really experienced leadership, and they made sure everybody was taken care of. They checked up on everybody. They made sure everybody was having contact with their family, because again, this, people won't remember this, but most people did not own cell phones. And because most people didn't own cell phones, that meant that there weren't a lot of towers. So we were in the mountains of Pennsylvania. We were given cell phones from the federal repository for that type of stuff, just like they talked about ventilators. We basically were in there, and they gave us cell phones, but they didn't work 90% of the time because we were in the mountains. But I can remember, like, I couldn't get a hold of my mom because she would be, by the time I got into my hotel room, she was asleep, and I would be leaving before she would be awake. And so, like, my boss and my team leader, he grabbed me at lunch one day and he handed me his cell phone and he said, "Call your mother." And I remember I had to walk way out into this field to get a reception. But my mom, who never answered her phone, she always let it go to the voice, to her voicemail. And then if she recognized the person, she would pick it up. She snatched that phone up so fast. She must have been standing right there waiting for me to call. So, and they set up an email station so that we could email people. They knew that that was important, that you have contact with your loved ones while you were working. So they did a lot, that, to make sure that people were okay and they were getting the emotional support they needed. Of course, I think, like everybody, like I think everybody wanted to help. Everybody wanted to do something somehow to help. So it was really, I felt very privileged that I did have a way to help. And so, but and the community that we were in Shanksville, they were very, very supportive of us. The way that we would have to drive in, because we actually usually, we always say it takes 48 hours for the mortuary team to arrive. So everything in the nearby area was taken in terms of hotel rooms. So, because the FBI had gotten there before us. So we ended up in Johnstown. And so we had a half-hour drive in every morning to the morgue. And the route that we took, the community figured it out. And they lined it, the school kids made posters for us, saying, thank you. And so it was really nice.
That's awesome. That's
Yeah.
so cool, though.
Yeah, and we had the Red Cross set out a tent outside of the morgue, and and they fed us. So, which was great because you work 12-hour days, and of course we weren't anywhere near where there was like any type of food. You couldn't run to McDonald's or anything. So it was very nice. And the ladies that ran the tent, the food tent, they took really good care of us, and they made us home baked goods, and they actually, they were very concerned about us being too stressed out. So they decided that they couldn't put out ketchup because they thought that the red ketchup would disturb us because it would look like blood. So I don't know if they still sell it, but back then they sold green and purple ketchup. So we had green and purple ketchup, which we all laughed at because we're like, it's not red anymore. But blood is not red anymore. But and we're like, this is really disturbing to have green on my hot dog. So, and the hotel that we stayed at, I think we took up all but like one or two rooms available for them, was the whole team. And one morning we woke up, and the staff of the hotel had given us little like goodie bags. So yeah, so there was, the good part was, like I said, feeling like you were making a difference and you had something important to do when everybody wanted that. And then the community was very supportive. That's kind of my story about being there. It is always the anniversary is always, I always get a little emotional. So